Good. So
Great.
great. Welcome, folks who are here at the moment in different time zones. Excited for the folks that are coming to join us. My name is Tahil Sharma. My pronouns are he and they, and I'm the program director at the Interfaith Center at Miami University. It's really a pleasure today to be able to have this really fascinating conversation with Reverend Dr. Katie Steele, who is releasing a book that I have been very curious to read and hear about. We have a fresh copy right there. And I'm really happy to be able to have the space to be able to, bring them in to be able to talk about something really cool. The name of their book is The Sacred Spark, Exploring the Hidden Gifts of ADHD in Spiritual Leadership. And we're going to start it off actually with being able to pass it over to Reverend Katie to be able to introduce herself, talk a little bit about why she wrote the book, and to actually hear an excerpt. Please go right ahead.
Yeah. Hi there. Welcome all. Thank you all so much for making time to zoom in on a Tuesday afternoon or evening, wherever you are. As Tahil said, I'm Reverend Dr. Katie. I'm currently the campus pastor at Miami or Wesley Campus Ministry, which is housed at Oxford United Methodist Church, right off the campus of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. So my primary gig these days is working with undergraduate college students and grad students when they wander in. But this past few years, I've also been working on a Doctor of Ministry through Drew Theological School in Madison, New Jersey. I started that program when I was still working in hospital chaplaincy, and they had created this really unique program in faith, health, and social equity, along with the Casperson School of Medicine. And so as I was starting that program, I was also working as a chaplain during a pandemic and working on my own ordination process through the United Methodist Church, which for anyone who might not be familiar is one of the most arduous ordination processes of the mainline denominations, and they're all pretty rigorous. You have to have a master's degree, and there are interviews and paperwork and all of these things, but it's a pretty lengthy process. And so, in the midst of all of that, especially during the pandemic and that ordination process, I noticed my anxiety sort of starting to increase, and was very well cared for, and started meeting with a therapist. And for the first time, she said, I don't think this is generalized. I think this is circumstantial. And actually, it wasn't the pandemic. I talk about it in the book. It was more the ordination process. And I was just feeling a certain sort of way. So, was put on meds for a minute, and that really took the edge off. But within probably 6 weeks, I noticed some other things happening, and I just wasn't feeling completely like myself, but I was at the same time. And I went back to my therapist to talk about that. And primarily, I wanted to talk about if there was a deeper underlying cause, because around that same time, I had a clergy colleague who had posted in a closed clergy group on Facebook some of what she had been experiencing, and she had just become diagnosed with ADHD in her 30s. And then another friend in her 30s, who's not related to the church at all, had posted an article on Facebook from, I think, The Guardian, titled "The Lost Girls," talking about this um, phenomenon of women in their 30s and 40s being diagnosed with ADHD, because all the research when we were younger was focused primarily on boys. And so I read that article especially and thought, oh my gosh, this really sounds like me. But that had never been kicked around in my entire life. Like, nobody had ever thought, Katie, do you think you have ADHD? So I went back to my therapist, and we spent an entire session talking about my childhood. And by the end, she's like, I can't test you, but I would suggest, I would support you if you did. And so that led to what's called a late diagnosis. And so it's been a multi-year journey, and I was in this program, and the more I was wrestling with it and learning to understand myself, the more I was realizing that um, many of my colleagues, especially clergy women, were sharing these same stories, and especially in my professional organization, Young Clergy Women International. And so it became my project. It was both a passion project and also started to feel more timely as time went on. And I had a great faculty advisor. So this is really a labor of love. The book is a lot of self-exploration, so it reads a little bit more like a memoir than really like a really heady academic text. But of course, it was for a doctor of ministry, and so there was a certain level of biblical study that needed to go in and interpretation. And so I chose the story of Mary and Martha. So the excerpt I'd like to share is parts of chapter 5, where I re-explore the siblings, Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus, um, as a family who might have had ADHD and just didn't know it because of the time they were in. But I chose this family because they are siblings, and we know that ADHD is highly genetic. So please receive this from chapter 5, Rereading Bethany, Reimagination, and Neurodivergent Possibility. Have you ever noticed how so many of our Bible stories seem to only be interpreted and shared in one or two certain predictable ways? Sometimes the continuity of hearing different pastors, churches, and every Bible study group I've ever been in tell familiar biblical stories the same way is a great comfort. In a world that is always changing, these consistent touch points can serve as a needed respite of familiarity and reprieve. Unfortunately, if we continue to share the same stories and interpret them in the same way, we, as Christians and people of faith, will remain stuck, which I'm afraid will then lead to limiting our own view and experience of God and who God is trying to tell us they are. In the well-known stories of Mary and Martha, their brother Lazarus, and their friend Jesus, we learn quite a bit about them. We know, or at least I've always been told, that these three are siblings, that Martha is a quote-unquote busybody who needs to learn how to take a break, and Mary is a daydreamer who would rather sit and listen to stories than help prepare the house for respected guests. We know that Lazarus died and that Martha and Mary expected their friend Jesus to come to their aid more quickly and to do more before their brother's death. Let us imagine for a moment that Martha, rather than being a busybody, as she has often been interpreted, is instead living with ADHD, hyperactive subtype. Instead of being an overly controlling type A personality who would rather chastise her sister for not helping her with the housework and women's work of waiting on their honored guest, she is transformed into someone who, instead of being seen as rude, is now someone who is simply internally compelled to keep moving. If Martha were to be diagnosed with ADHD hyperactive type, she could simply be feeling as if she is being run by a motor at all times. Even when she might want to stop, sit, and simply listen to Jesus herself, there's a dysregulation of her focus and energy, and she simply can't turn it off or regulate her energy at will. This, while sometimes problematic, is what helps their household run, because while she can't regulate her constant movement, it is what allows her to attend to the many tasks of keeping their home running. She is the sibling who can follow through on the cooking and the cleaning and the going to the market and paying their taxes and temple tithes on a regular basis. Martha is also, in this telling, the sibling who observes the others most closely. And in her years of being the primary caretaker for her sister Mary, she has realized that Mary does best when she is kept on a regular schedule. If left to her own devices, Mary, who is living with undiagnosed ADHD inattentive subtype, would spend most of her days unaware of the passage of time, forgetting to eat at regular intervals and overlooking most of the housekeeping needs. Without prompting and gentle guidance from her sister Martha, Mary would fall further and further behind her peers, even as women were not often going to a formal education in the same way as their brothers, fathers, uncles, and cousins were. Mary would have fallen behind in learning the domestic skills taught by the older women in their community and would have struggled to keep the relationships of any kind, friendships or otherwise. It would be hard for their father to find a husband for her, and given her higher needs than Martha's, acumen about how to best care for her sister, the thing that made the most sense was to ask their brother Lazarus if he would be willing to share his inheritance to ensure his sister's well-being. Lazarus, who conceivably was living with ADHD combined type, was more than happy to agree to this arrangement. Not only did he love his sisters very much, but he also knew that without husbands of their own, when their parents died, he would be the one left to take care of them. Unfortunately, Lazarus finds it hard enough to take care of himself. He often gets so absorbed at work to the point where he will look up and hours will have passed, and he realizes that he has forgotten to eat any meals all day. He rarely remembers to go to the market, and when he does, he either buys far too much or not nearly enough. His finances are often askew, and the thought of having to one day support his sisters is so overwhelming, it nearly paralyzes him to even think about it. By accepting his father's request and in collaboration with his sisters, they contrive a subversive system that benefits them all, completely working around the social norms of their day. They set up households in Bethany that are close enough to each other so that even after they leave their father's house, they can continue to work together to take care of each other. Lazarus providing the needed oversight and permission for things the women need, and his sisters ensuring he stays well fed and his home livable, as he likely also is not a top contender for marriage, given his absent-mindedness and over-focus at work. ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions are classified as disabilities, and those of us who are diagnosed with them need to be given permission to see ourselves in our sacred texts. Seeing neurodiverse people in scripture is also important for those around us who may never know we have a disability unless we choose to disclose it. If we truly believe that all persons are made in the image of God, then these three siblings are yet reflections of the divine creator. Why wouldn't we imagine, given the prevalence of neurodiversity, that God's own self would be reflected in those who have these diagnoses? So there you have my reinterpretation of a few biblical characters who might have been living with what I like to call neurosparkliness. I know in the current lexicon, a lot of folks say neurospicy, but as somebody who has some sensitivities, I don't really like things that are spicy. So I've just turned it into neurosparkliness, which I think inspired the the woman who did the cover art for me to make such a beautiful sparkly brain. So um, thank you all for listening. And I think there were some maybe questions and then an open Q&A time.
Oh yes, I absolutely have questions because this has
Yes.
been ever since I've just, been preparing for this event and sharing information about it. I mean, it's been so complicated getting to navigate the very real conversations around neurodivergence, disability rights, and the presence of folks who have physical and mental challenges within religious spaces. Um,
Mhm.
we always know of the horror stories where it has always been thought that through the lens of healing or negligence or so many other
Mhm.
things, we
Yeah.
can't have the opportunity to actually to see the neurobrilliance of
Yeah.
individuals in this example in particular. And particularly, I guess my question comes from, what does this mean as a message to folks who really maybe still are struggling with either one, understanding their own mental health or
Mhm.
understanding the mental health of someone that they may know
Mhm.
because they've been given certain, interpretations religiously and socially. How do you feel this book might be able to help with trying to reimagine the relationship to how we understand our mental health in a
Mhm.
faith-based?
Yeah, thank you. That is so important. And a lot of what I kept thinking and experiencing myself, right, was um both outside stigma as I was sharing this, especially with people who have known me um, as a certain way. And it's not like I changed, but because there was such internalized stigma from all of those voices, like even if you have the most loving, supporting home, family, or community, and all of these things, um, especially in our context in the United States, and especially now when there is this like, let's find the reason, let's find a fix, let's find this, even on like a national level, not even religiously. I think it's even more important to change that conversation. And as somebody who was raised in a family of faith, who has also heard the consistent message that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that God gives us gifts. One of the things I really hope for this book is that it can open some conversation and some ways of thinking of like, wait, maybe nothing's actually wrong here. Maybe this is a spiritual gift in the same way that hospitality or teaching or administration is a gift, right? As they're more usually named in scripture. Um, because um, I think that's really, really important because you're right. So much harm is done in religion. I'm thinking of books like My Body Is Not a Prayer Request. And I know too many people who, I mean, even strangers on the street will walk up and say, "Oh, let me pray for you." And my friend's in a wheelchair, and like she'll be like, this person praying for me at the grocery store is not going to help me walk. Like I have, so these are just unseen or seen in a different way. And then I think the other thing that's important, which is maybe just sort of in between, is just the historical context and the context in which we live. Because as I was doing this research, there were some scholars who were saying, ADHD and other neurodiversity is actually um, a sign of evolution. And like if we still lived in a hunter-gatherer society, it was those of us with neurodiversity who were more likely to be like thinking outside the box. And if we can't find food here anymore, let's go over there, let's do that, or let's do that. And it was actually part of survival. But in an industrialized age, that changes and it becomes a deficient, right? So I think that also really matters when we have the conversation. It's just recontextualizing where we are.
Yeah, and I think that's such a fascinating point, right? Because it is talking about sort of the continuous development of how we think, how we connect with each other, how we connect with nature. And I think it's so interesting to me that, you were able to take that lens and thinking about some of the stories that come out of the Bible. Especially because a lot of people wouldn't think about putting sort of modern interpretations or modern standards of our thinking to what we
Mhm.
would consider the stories of folks from thousands of years ago. But what we end up realizing is that, yeah, because they didn't have names or research or things that brought them
Mhm.
to those conclusions. And I feel like there may be some pushback to that
Mhm.
from folks who tend to believe that like the modern era of science and unfortunately um, does not have a capped limit on where it can go, but it certainly also doesn't help answer a lot of the questions that people may have of these folks that come out of stories like from the Old and New Testament. So I guess
Mhm.
a question that I have as a bit of a devil's advocate is, what do you say to people who may look at this and say, "Oh, but if that's the word of God and you're putting these ideas of like neurodivergence in the conversation, like does it take away from the validity or the sanctity or the purpose of those stories that are mentioned in the Old and New Testament?"
Well, first of all, my preaching professor in seminary, if she ever heard anyone say, "I'm going to play devil's advocate," she'd go, he doesn't need an
Yes.
advocate. Don't do
No,
that.
he doesn't.
Don't do that." So that's always just what rings in my head. But um, yeah, I think certainly there are certain traditions and denominations and groups that aren't aren't ever really going to engage the conversation, right? Because this is what we believe in, this is how we believe it, and get on board or get out. And so I think the first thing I would just try and assess is like, is the person asking the question because they're really open to conversation and learning, or not, because at least for what I'm learning about my own neurodiversity is that I only have a certain amount I only have so much energy in a day and I can get depleted really quickly. So the first thing I would just say to anyone who's engaging those kinds of conversations is like, do a self-assessment. Like, do you have the energy to even engage in that? Because I think it's in some ways okay to disagree. But for those who are willing, and if you have the spoons and capacity to engage the conversation, I would gently challenge them to first, like, why are you so adverse to a new reinterpretation or a new um, idea or a new thought? And if they're not familiar, I mean, really, this was less exegesis and like digging into the context and the history and the language, and it was more of almost a Jewish midrash, which is this theological interpretation that comes from our Jewish siblings and rabbis, especially, of like imagining beyond the text. Um, and the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think you had a good point earlier. Like, things were probably going on that folks in that day and age just didn't have a name for, didn't understand, didn't have the research about. Um, and so, personally, I would say to this conversation partner that, at least for me, reimagining some biblical stories with a neurodivergent lens, with a queer lens, with a womanist lens, like all of these different ways we can um, look at scripture and holy texts, often for me, I find makes them deeper and fuller and richer, and it makes it more exciting because I can read the same story. And how many times have I heard the story of Mary and Martha? Like, probably hundreds. Um, but this was a whole new way of imagining them, right? And it really comes, and I do also have to give credit to my friend, Reverend Dr. Melanie Reuter, who did her Doctor of Ministry in 2008. And she was the one who first interpreted Mary of Bethany as a girl with Down syndrome. And then you can't really tell in this picture, but she made a beautiful cross-stitch piece. Um, and when I heard about her research so many years ago, it just stuck with me. And so that sort of gave me permission to then take it a step further, and think about all three siblings.
Yeah, and it takes me into one other question before I pass it on to other
Mhm,
folks who are here. About the question of representation.
mhm,
What does it mean for the conversation around these stories, leadership that we find among pastors and reverends, to be able to talk about these issues not just from a place of, oh, these issues exist,
mhm,
and pray over them, we can pray about them, to, oh, these are my lived experiences. What can it mean for us to actually lean into the divinity that exists with those things in mind? And how can we have a more robust conversation about not trying to get rid of people's divinity because these things exist within us?
mhm, mhm. Um, wow, that I should have had you write these questions down earlier. These are really great.
It just came
And I
up,
don't,
so
and what if,
take the
well, and
time.
I'm not always great on the spot, so you just, my brain likes to buffer.
Yeah.
Um, but no, this is great because you're right. Representation does matter. I think it's very important for folks in the pews, children and youth especially, to know that they can be in leadership, that they have gifts and graces. Um, but I think also, I don't think, I know, at least in my own theological understanding, that God created us to be communal, right? Like, we are not individual creatures. And again, thinking about our own context here in the United States, we're such an individualistic society. And so I think one of the things that really we're going to need to see a sea change in is not only, for the love of goodness, stop calling these things deficits and disabilities, because they're gifts, right? They're a different way of being. They're a different way of the imago Dei, the image of God, to be on each person. If we are created in God's image, then of course God in some ways is disabled, and God some ways is neurodiverse, and transcends race and all of the things that we can say is different about us. Um, but we're not called to hold it alone. And I think that's really a big downfall, especially, and this was just my passion because I am a clergy person and I had to narrow the study because it was part of a dissertation. Um, but it can be lonely and it can be hard and you can feel like you have to carry it yourself. But if we can get to a point where folks feel safe and free enough to say, hey, this is how I'm created and I can do these things really, really well, but I need help in these other areas, and then allow the community to come around and provide supports, um, what a change that would make. And in the disability advocacy that I am aware of, I think one of the greatest um, repeating mantras is accessibility for one means accessibility for all, right? Like, um, if it even if it you think it's only going to help this small group of people, it's really going to help everybody. um and I think that's what we need to see is less, you know you need to get meds, you need to be fixed, you need to do this, and put it all on the individual person, and instead look around and say, what can we do to support everyone? So um the one example I'm thinking of that's more physical disability, but I think is a great example, is at Miami at the Student Center. Every elevator has regular buttons you can push up here in the elevator, but they also have, I think we're the only place, I heard recently, we might be the only place that has foot buttons for the elevator. So that means folks in wheelchairs can can use their wheelchair to bump the button. And it actually made it onto, if you follow Shane Burkaw and his wife Hannah, they go by Squirmy and Grubs on instant or on social media. They recently came to talk about their book Interabled, about their interabled relationship, and they made a reel that posted a couple weeks after they were on campus, and Shane said, this is the first time I'm ever able to use an elevator by myself in his life, because he was able to use his wheelchair to do that. And I was thinking, I don't necessarily need those, but when I'm walking around the student center and I've got my arms full of stuff because my group is going to table on campus, like I use those foot buttons all the time. So even though they weren't made for me, like they're still helpful for me, right? So if we help one, we help all.
For wanting to hear this question, beforehand, you still answered it in a really direct way. So
Thank you.
kudos to you for that. But I think that was really definitely beautifully put, and I think it's really cool to have that kind of accessibility and just something that we think as mundane as an elevator, which you already think is accessible for people with mobility issues. But thinking about the different ways that those mobility issues impact them is actually a really interesting way to see how we're thinking about accommodations and how it's not just an idea, but it's actually something we put into practice in multiple ways, multiple parts of our lives. So yeah, that's really great. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. Thanks for
I'll
such a
open it
great
up
question.
to yeah. I'll open it up to the folks that are in the room with us to see if anyone would like to ask any other questions.
I was just thinking as you were talking about the elevator thing and making like one thing easier for a group of people makes things easier for a lot of people. In your book, you talk about one of your recommendations is like making long meetings shorter, like make them first.
Yeah.
Couldn't we all benefit from shorter meetings? Like that would be
Amen.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of your recommendations were like, I think that would make the world more convenient for everyone involved, you know? But then my question would be, you have a ton of research enough to like create a book and a dissertation. Um, but I think as often is the case in research, like we have rabbit trails that we have to cut off somewhere in order to
Hmm.
focus on the main point. If you could take this research and you were to extend it, what are some of those like rabbit
Mm,
trails that you would pursue, or where
yeah.
else would you take this research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think obviously like the first one is just gender. Like pastors are not only women. And of course that was just my passion and where I um first started seeing this phenomenon. And I think because the research of ADHD in particular had left girls and women out, it was a logical place to start. But I think as far as how do we make the church more inclusive and how do we better support clergy, I think that I was, um, limited. I had, I think, one non-binary participant, but definitely a wider subset of clergy. I think I could do a whole second book on autism, and because that's also something that's underdiagnosed in women. And now that ADHD is coming out, we're learning that autism is often a co-occurring condition. And I think there are some traits of autism that would also suit folks for ministry, but not in a typical way. Um, and then I would also, if I had time and the funding, right, I would love to actually go into churches and interview church leaders and leadership boards about, especially in the churches where pastors have left. Like I wouldn't necessarily go back to a church that I left, but I would love like my research participants who did leave their churches. Like I would love to go to those churches and just ask, what did you notice? What was hard for the congregation? Um, and then see if I could figure out how to bring those parties closer together to understanding. Because I think that's really what it was. It wasn't that um, people were trying to be, well, maybe I shouldn't say that, mean to their pastors, but again, that better understanding of, and something as simple as I just think, I don't know, I can't remember if I use this uh, example in the book, but in not just my first church, but in two or three different work locations now, I've had people be like, I say your name or I say hi to you and you don't respond. And I've had to ask, like, was my face in my computer? In at least two of those places, the desk that I wasn't able to move because of the space had my back to the door. And it's like I was not trying, I either had very tiny earbuds in you couldn't see to help me focus, or I was just so hyper focused. I was not trying to be rude. I literally, my brain did not register you're saying hi to me. And so even simple things of just helping people understand it's okay to tap them on the shoulder or like knock on the door would go a long way, I think, to ease some of those miscommunications.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lots of ways I'd love to expand this. Great question, Connie.
Nolan, did you have a question?
I don't, well, this is new and it's not new. I mean, I subscribe to the Progressive magazine, and one of the writers is has disabilities, and he's always reflecting on what he's um, sort of invisible and then confronting the dominant culture. So I'm aware of that. First, a very mundane question, Katie. Who is the publisher of this book? Being a librarian, I
Um,
need to know.
yes, that's it. I would love to plug them. It's Tehom Center Publishing, which is TEHOM. It is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit press, founded by my faculty advisor. Actually, it's very new. I mean, it's been around for 8 years, but it really started publishing 2 or 3 years ago. And they focus on queer, BIPOC, feminist authors, queer authors. And they're focused on marginalized ministers. They do a lot of publishing of not just Christian, but religious and spiritual folks at the margins. And their winter writing cohort is open for registration through mid-January. So if anyone you know is looking to write a book, I'm
Right.
now on their spiritual acquisitions team. So I'll just give that plug right now.
Oh,
That
excellent,
Tay Home
excellent.
is great to
And
work
so
with. And
I can't help but thinking, of course, of St. David's Glenview. You know
yep,
it fairly well,
yes.
which certainly represents the dominant culture.
Uh-huh.
And they do have an elevator. The old one was just impossible. They got a new one on.
Hmm.
But that's it. And I think the larger, deeper issues you're raising would be completely new to this parish. So,
I believe so. Yes. Yes.
right.
Um, yes. And that was for those of you who don't know, that was the parish I worked at when I was in seminary, where Newland and I met. And looking back, I can also see now where um even though I didn't know, but I can look back now and say, oh, that's how my ADHD was affecting how I was reacting to things or how I was approaching things. And both for good and for challenge. It's never one or the other entirely.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That
No, I
actually
think the
makes
bottom line is I've learned so much. So, thank you.
You're
Go
welcome.
ahead.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, to that point, actually, um, Reverend Katie, I had a question about if your ADHD has impacted things like writing sermons, and what
Oh,
that experience may have been like with you realizing where that's played a role.
yeah. Well, so first of all, I was out since I was in chaplaincy by the time I was working on this project. I really haven't preached a whole lot since I was diagnosed, which is interesting.
Mm,
Um, but I will say the the being able to think outside the box and see similarities in potentially dissimilar things that ADHD often affords folks. I like to think that my sermons are a little out of the box, and I do look for those lesser known interpretations or try to find really interesting parallels to what's happening in the news cycle or books that come out, media, things like that. But I don't know if this was more ADHD or the rector I worked under when I was in seminary. This was also an accessibility thing though, but she was very hard of hearing. She wears hearing aids. And so she had just a huge heart for other folks who were hard of hearing. So one of her requirements was that our sermons were transcripted entirely so we could print a copy and put it in the Northex. And I was already pretty much a transcript preacher, which was maybe just to keep me on focus. Um, but that's just sort of been ever since. And then I can also have somebody edit it before I preach it, which I know I've gotten some feedback from some people like, you need to be less tied to paper and don't read your sermon to us. And, preaching is such a personal thing. Again, that maybe that's something people, if we could magically just get churches to stop commenting about the actual physicality of preaching, like whether your pastor uses bullet notes or a tablet or 6 pages of paper, like let them do their thing. It's hard enough as it is. Um, but I do know some folks that I interviewed said that they transcript because if don't they know that they'll go off on a tangent and the sermon will be twice as long as it would be otherwise. So
I mean, I really do resonate with that because as someone who, you know, has the opposite experience. Like I cannot tie myself to to reading from something I have
mhm.
written down as much as I may have more creativity or may have more control of how I want to say what I want to say. But somehow the minute I get the chance to read it, I cannot focus for the life of
Yeah.
me. And it becomes it becomes an experience of just like, I'm just gonna say what's coming to mind right now. And
Yeah.
I think there's just something really beautiful about how I think the reason why the spiritual leadership and the impact of having things like ADHD is such a fascinating conversation because I think it also really does tend to show that like do we know what was happening in the minds of preachers and writers of sacred
Hmm.
texts for them to have the impact of what they wrote now have, the ripple effect that it does now.
Yeah.
And it just continues to be just such a fascinating like lens into how we're also seeing this leadership. Were there any other questions that were coming to mind to folks? No. I guess maybe to then just wrap up the time together. I guess one more question that I have that won't be as complicated as the last one I asked, I
No, that's okay.
promise.
I love it.
Um, what would be some of the biggest lessons that you hope people can take from
Mm.
reading?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, I mean, the first one is that it is a gift, right? It's how we're created. If this could even chip a little bit away at the stigma, and fight back at the current cultural narrative about causes and fixes, like I would love that. There's already so much, um, that makes us hard on ourselves. I think helping folks see how they're created as a beautiful thing, would be huge. Um, I would love for, um, churches especially to, well, and anyone who loves someone with ADHD and doesn't understand them, to understand that we're really trying as hard as we can. I don't know a single person with ADHD who isn't trying and isn't working on some level harder or more hours to produce what feels like less. Um, and that can become almost like a shame spiral in our own brains. And so, um, having people understand that and give some grace, would be really, really helpful. Um, I also think just having folks write things down for their ADHD, clergy especially. Um, like, I love that I get to see you on Sunday and that you want to tell me something that you want me to follow up on later in the week, but it's not like my brain is like, just email it to me. Um, like that would, I mean, I think that would just alleviate a lot of things in churches if, we could standardize, like, if you want your pastor to know it, you got to put it in an email or you got to write it down and put it on their desk. Um, and I wanted to do like a clean, tidy five, but, there are really so many things that I hope come. But I mean, just love and respect and understanding. If it increases understanding, I think it will have done a good job, as a first foray into this.
I think that still is a beautiful reminder. I think the love and respect that we hold for each other means that we'll show up for each other the ways that we're asking for, not the ways that we assume people need it. And I think that's a really great thing to be able to learn from what you've shared, from your reflections to what I think is the wisdom that you're going to be sharing in your book. So I guess technically this is the last question. Where can people find your book?
Yeah, so, the book is available. Newland asked the great question about the publisher. So if you go to tehomecenter.org, it's available on the Tehome site. It's available on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, Bookshop. I would actually recommend people buy through Bookshop because it also, supports local indie bookstores.
Right.
If you are in or near Cincinnati or know me personally, you can ask me for a copy. I still have like 75 copies in my car, because authors are usually asked to buy the first 100 copies. So, would love to get those out into the world. But it's, the supplier is Ingram Press, so really you should be able to get it anywhere Ingram, books are sold.
Super. Well, thank you so much for your time,
You're welcome.
Reverend Katie. Thank you for your wisdom in this book. I think it's going to be a really great read for those who are interested in the subject, but I think
Yep,
it's also just something that might actually help to demystify some stereotypes, which I think are going to be really important for folks to learn. So thank you for your time today and sharing.
absolutely.
Thank you to Connie and Newland for being part of the conversation today.
Yep.
And thank you to all of the folks who are watching right now or are going to be watching in the future. We hope you'll join us for more programs at the Interfaith Center, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks to you and the Interface Center at Miami
Thank you
for
much.
Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
Good to
Bye.
see you
Thank
all.
you.